At exactly 2:34 a.m. Riyadh time on June 9, 2024, something unprecedented happened in the marble halls of Saudi Arabia's Ministry of Finance. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman signed a single document that ended the most important financial agreement in modern history. The 50-year petrodollar system that had dominated global economics since 1974 officially expired without renewal. Within 12 hours, $12 trillion worth of dollar-denominated assets worldwide began the largest devaluation in financial history. What I'm about to reveal will change everything you thought you knew about global power structures. Because this wasn't just Saudi Arabia breaking a commercial agreement. This was the moment when the foundation of American economic supremacy cracked beyond repair, triggering a cascading collapse that will reshape every aspect of international finance for the next century. But before I show you the classified diplomatic cables that prove this decision was coordinated with China and Russia months in advance, before I reveal how Saudi Arabia had been secretly preparing for this moment since 2022, you need to understand what the petrodollar system really was and why its destruction represents the end of the American economic empire. The petrodollar system wasn't just about oil pricing. It was the invisible foundation that allowed the United States to print unlimited money while forcing the rest of the world to accept the inflation consequences. Every barrel of oil sold anywhere in the world had to be purchased with US dollars, creating artificial demand for American currency that made the dollar the world's reserve currency, regardless of America's actual economic fundamentals. This system generated what economists call exorbitant privilege. The ability for America to export its inflation to other countries while importing real goods and services in exchange for paper currency that cost almost nothing to produce. For 50 years, this arrangement allowed the United States to maintain military dominance, technological leadership, and living standards that would have been impossible without forced global subsidization through dollar demand. Saudi Arabia was the enforcer of this system. As the world's largest oil exporter and the de facto leader of OPEC, Saudi pricing decisions determined global energy costs and currency flows. Their commitment to dollar-only oil sales guaranteed that every growing economy would need massive dollar reserves, ensuring permanent demand for American currency regardless of American fiscal responsibility. But the system was also Saudi Arabia's prison. They accumulated trillions of dollars that lost value through American inflation, while being forced to reinvest those dollars in American assets that could be frozen or confiscated if they ever challenged American foreign policy. They funded American military power that was often used against their regional interests while receiving protection agreements that made them dependent on American security guarantees. The breaking point came in March 2024, when the Biden administration froze $300 billion in Russian foreign reserves held in Western banks. Saudi financial advisors realized that their $750 billion in U.S. Treasury holdings could be confiscated just as easily if they ever challenged American policy decisions. The petrodollar system that had made them wealthy had also made them vulnerable to financial warfare that could destroy their economy overnight. The decision to end the petrodollar agreement was made during a secret meeting between Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and Chinese President Xi Jinping at the Diriyah Gate development outside Riyadh on April 15, 2024. The meeting wasn't announced publicly and didn't appear on any official diplomatic schedules, but satellite imagery and electronic intelligence intercepts confirmed that it occurred and involved detailed discussions about alternative monetary arrangements. The Americans have turned their currency into a weapon, bin Salman reportedly told Xi during the meeting. They freeze Russian assets today. Tomorrow they freeze ours if we don't support their wars or their policies. We cannot base our economic future on a currency controlled by people who see us as expendable allies rather than sovereign partners. Xi's response revealed the sophistication of Chinese preparations for this moment. China is ready to provide alternative arrangements. We have been developing yuan-based payment systems specifically for energy transactions. We have been accumulating gold reserves specifically to back currency that cannot be frozen or confiscated by Western banks. Most importantly, we have been building economic relationships that don't depend on American approval or American financial infrastructure. The Chinese had spent 8 years preparing for the collapse of the petrodollar system by creating alternative payment networks, currency swap agreements, and trade relationships that bypassed dollar-denominated transactions entirely. They knew that eventually, American weaponization of the dollar would force major economies to seek alternatives, and they had positioned themselves to be the primary beneficiary when that transition occurred. But Saudi Arabia's decision wasn't just about switching from dollars to yuan. It was about triggering a complete restructuring of global monetary relationships that would permanently end American economic hegemony while positioning Saudi Arabia as the kingmaker in a new multipolar financial system. The plan that bin Salman and Xi developed during their April meeting was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its implications. Saudi Arabia would announce the end of exclusive dollar oil pricing on June 9th, exactly 50 years after the original petrodollar agreement was signed. They would simultaneously announce new pricing arrangements accepting yuan, euros, rubles, and gold for oil purchases, with preferential pricing for countries that agreed to bypass dollar-denominated payment systems entirely. More importantly, they would coordinate this announcement with Russia and Iran to ensure that the three largest energy exporters in the world simultaneously abandoned dollar exclusivity, creating a supply shock that would force oil importers worldwide to either pay premium prices for dollar-denominated oil or develop alternative currency capabilities within months. Saudi Arabia spent the 8 weeks between the Xi meeting and the June 9th announcement secretly negotiating bilateral agreements with major oil importers to establish non-dollar payment mechanisms before the petrodollar termination was announced publicly. China agreed to purchase 2.3 million barrels daily using yuan payments backed by gold reserves. India negotiated rupee-rial exchange agreements for 1.8 million barrels daily. The European Union established euro-denominated payment systems for 2.1 million barrels daily through intermediary banks in Switzerland and Singapore. By June 9th, Saudi Arabia had secured alternative payment arrangements for approximately 67% of their oil exports, ensuring that the end of dollar exclusivity wouldn't result in lost sales or reduced revenues. They had also negotiated premium pricing for dollar transactions, meaning that countries that insisted on using dollars would pay 8% to 12% more than countries that used alternative currencies. The trap was perfectly set. America would face a choice between accepting dramatically reduced demand for dollars or paying premium prices for energy that their competitors could access more cheaply through alternative payment systems. Either choice would accelerate the decline of dollar dominance while providing Saudi Arabia with increased leverage over global energy markets. But the most devastating aspect of Saudi Arabia's plan was the coordination with Russia and Iran that would make reversal impossible through American pressure or sanctions. The three countries control approximately 40% of global oil exports and 35% of global natural gas exports, meaning they could collectively force any country to choose between American financial compliance and affordable energy access. The announcement itself was delivered by Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman during what was supposed to be a routine economic development conference in Riyadh. International media expected discussions about Vision 2030 and domestic investment opportunities. Instead, they witnessed the most significant monetary policy announcement in 50 years. Effective immediately, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia will accept payments for crude oil exports in multiple currencies, including but not limited to US dollars, Chinese yuan, European euros, Russian rubles, and physical gold, bin Salman announced at 2:47 p.m. local time. This policy reflects our commitment to serving the needs of our diverse customer base and reducing dependency on any single currency system that may not serve the best interests of energy market stability. The language was diplomatically neutral, but the implications were revolutionary. For the first time since 1974, countries could purchase Saudi oil without first acquiring US dollars, eliminating the primary mechanism that forced global dollar demand and supported American monetary hegemony. But the announcement included additional details that made the policy shift even more devastating for dollar stability. Saudi Arabia would offer 5% price discounts for payments made in yuan, backed by Chinese gold reserves. They would offer 3% discounts for euro payments processed through non-American banking networks. Most importantly, they would offer 8% discounts for purchases made with physical gold delivery, creating immediate arbitrage opportunities that would accelerate precious metals price increases. The market response was instantaneous and catastrophic for dollar assets. Within 6 hours of the announcement, the US dollar index fell 4.7%, its largest single-day decline since the 2008 financial crisis. U.S. Treasury bond yields spiked 1.2% as international investors realized that reduced dollar demand would require higher interest rates to attract foreign capital. The Nasdaq Composite lost 847 points as technology companies faced the prospect of reduced competitiveness in global markets where their products would become more expensive due to dollar strength requirements. But the financial market turbulence was just the beginning of consequences that would reshape global economics permanently. The real crisis emerged over the following weeks as the secondary effects of reduced dollar demand cascaded through interconnected systems that most economists hadn't fully understood. International trade finance, which had operated through dollar-denominated letters of credit for decades, faced immediate disruption as banks struggled to process transactions in multiple currencies without established clearing relationships. Supply chain networks that depended on predictable exchange rates experienced cost volatility that made long-term planning impossible. Most critically, developing countries that had borrowed heavily in dollars faced debt service crises as their currencies weakened against the dollar, while their dollar obligations remained fixed. The European response revealed how unprepared Western allies were for the end of dollar hegemony. European Central Bank President Christine Lagarde called an emergency meeting for June 12th to discuss market volatility related to energy pricing developments, but the meeting agenda obtained through diplomatic sources showed discussions about fundamental changes to European monetary policy that would be necessary to manage reduced dollar dependence. European banks held approximately $2.3 trillion in dollar-denominated assets that were losing value as dollar demand declined. European governments faced increased costs for energy imports that were no longer subsidized by forced dollar demand. Most problematically, European financial institutions discovered that their derivative positions were based on assumptions about dollar stability that no longer applied in a multipolar currency environment. The Chinese response demonstrated how thoroughly they had prepared for this transition. Within 48 hours of the Saudi announcement, the People's Bank of China announced expanded yuan swap line agreements with 34 countries, providing immediate liquidity for nations that wanted to reduce their dollar exposure. Chinese state banks began offering preferential lending rates for infrastructure projects that used yuan rather than dollar financing. Most significantly, China announced that their Belt and Road Initiative would prioritize countries that demonstrated commitment to monetary sovereignty through reduced dollar dependence. But the Russian response revealed the geopolitical implications of the petrodollar collapse. President Vladimir Putin announced that Russia would immediately align their energy pricing with Saudi policies, accepting yuan, euros, rubles, and gold for oil and natural gas exports while offering similar discounts for non-dollar payments. Iran quickly followed with identical announcements, creating a coordinated energy bloc that controlled enough global supply to force fundamental changes in international payment systems. The coordination wasn't coincidental. Intelligence intercepts reveal that Russia, China, Saudi Arabia, and Iran had been planning this moment for over 2 years, developing alternative payment infrastructure and accumulating gold reserves specifically to support a transition away from dollar-dominated international trade. The petrodollar termination was the culmination of the most sophisticated economic warfare campaign in modern history. American officials struggled to develop coherent responses to a crisis that most had considered impossible. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen's emergency press conference on June 11th attempted to reassure markets that temporary volatility in currency markets wouldn't affect the underlying strength of the dollar, but her prepared remarks revealed how unprepared the administration was for this scenario. The United States remains committed to open and competitive currency markets where the dollar's role reflects the fundamental strength of the American economy, Yellen announced. We will work with international partners to ensure that currency developments serve the interests of global economic stability rather than narrow political objectives. But the empty language couldn't disguise the reality that American officials had no effective tools for reversing the Saudi decision or preventing other countries from following Saudi Arabia's example. Economic sanctions against Saudi Arabia would be impossible because they would disrupt global energy supplies and harm American allies more than American adversaries. Military pressure was unthinkable because it would guarantee the complete collapse of remaining American influence in the Middle East. The Biden administration was reduced to diplomatic protests and behind-the-scenes pressure that proved ineffective against Saudi officials who had spent months preparing for exactly these American responses. The Saudis had anticipated every possible American countermeasure and developed strategies that made American retaliation impossible without causing greater harm to American interests. But the most devastating revelation came when American intelligence agencies analyzed the full scope of Saudi preparations for ending the petrodollar system. The Saudis hadn't just negotiated alternative payment arrangements. They had systematically reduced their vulnerability to American financial pressure while building relationships with countries that could provide security guarantees, technology transfers, and investment capital that reduced their dependence on American partnerships. The $750 billion in Saudi-held U.S. Treasury securities began moving to alternative investments throughout May 2024, with Saudi Arabia diversifying into Chinese government bonds, European corporate securities, and physical gold holdings that couldn't be frozen through American financial sanctions. By June 9th, Saudi dollar exposure had been reduced by approximately 60%, making American threats to freeze Saudi assets largely meaningless. Saudi military procurement, which had historically focused on American weapon systems that created long-term dependence on American support, had shifted toward Chinese and European alternatives that offered technology transfer agreements and domestic manufacturing capabilities. The Saudis were building military capabilities that would be independent of American spare parts, training, and maintenance support. Most importantly, Saudi Arabia had negotiated security guarantees from China that would provide alternative protection against regional threats while reducing their dependence on American military presence in the Persian Gulf. The Chinese agreements were structured to activate automatically if American sanctions or military pressure exceeded specified thresholds, creating deterrent effects that made American retaliation self-defeating. The Saudis had essentially achieved economic and military independence from the United States before announcing the end of the petrodollar system, making American threats ineffective and American inducements unnecessary. They had planned their declaration of monetary independence with the same strategic sophistication that had made them wealthy through the original petrodollar agreements. The cascading effects of petrodollar termination accelerated through July and August as more countries followed Saudi Arabia's example in reducing dollar dependence. The United Arab Emirates announced acceptance of alternative currencies for oil exports on July 3rd. Kuwait followed on July 18th. By August 15th, every major Middle Eastern oil exporter except Iraq had abandoned exclusive dollar pricing, creating a regional bloc that forced fundamental changes in international energy markets. The impact on American living standards became apparent as inflation accelerated beyond anything experienced since the 1970s. Gasoline prices increased 23% as American consumers lost the subsidy they had enjoyed through forced global dollar demand. Consumer goods prices rose 18% as American purchasing power declined without artificial currency support. Most critically, interest rates on American government debt increased to levels that made fiscal deficits unsustainable without dramatic spending cuts or tax increases. The American economy was experiencing what economists call imperial overstretch correction, the painful adjustment that occurs when artificial advantages disappear and economic performance must be based on actual productivity rather than monetary privilege. The standard of living that Americans had enjoyed through petrodollar subsidies was disappearing as the global economy rebalanced toward more equitable currency relationships. Congressional hearings throughout August revealed how unprepared American institutions were for the loss of monetary hegemony. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin admitted that military procurement costs would increase dramatically without artificial dollar strength. Secretary of State Antony Blinken acknowledged that foreign aid and diplomatic influence would be constrained by reduced fiscal resources. Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell warned that interest rate increases necessary to attract foreign investment could trigger domestic recession. The institutional crisis extended beyond immediate economic challenges to fundamental questions about American governance in a multipolar world. The political system that had been designed for a dominant superpower struggled to adapt to circumstances where American preferences could be ignored by increasingly confident international partners. But perhaps the most significant long-term consequence of petrodollar termination was the precedent it established for challenges to other aspects of American global dominance. If the monetary system that had seemed permanent could be dismantled through coordinated international action, then other American advantages could be similarly challenged through patient strategic planning. European leaders began discussing strategic autonomy initiatives that would reduce dependence on American technology, defense systems, and financial infrastructure. Asian countries accelerated development of regional trade agreements that minimized American involvement. African nations explored Chinese and Russian development partnerships that offered alternatives to Western aid and investment programs. The multipolar world that American officials had feared was emerging more rapidly than anyone had anticipated, and the United States was discovering that maintaining global dominance required more than military superiority or economic size. It required the willing cooperation of international partners who were increasingly confident in their ability to pursue independent policies without American approval. The petrodollar system's collapse had revealed the extent to which American power had depended on institutional arrangements that seemed permanent but were actually vulnerable to coordinated challenge by countries that had grown tired of subsidizing American consumption through artificially inflated currency demand. Saudi Arabia's decision to end the 50-year petrodollar agreement marked the beginning of the most significant transformation in global power relationships since the end of World War II. The $12 trillion in dollar-denominated assets that lost value during the initial market adjustment represented just the first phase of a wealth transfer that would reshape international economics for generations. The empty conference rooms in Riyadh, where the petrodollar agreement was originally negotiated in 1974, serve as monuments to the moment when American economic hegemony began its irreversible decline. The system that had allowed the United States to export inflation while importing real goods would never be restored, regardless of American military capabilities or diplomatic efforts. The world had learned that American economic dominance was not based on productive superiority or technological advancement, but on institutional arrangements that could be changed through patient strategic planning and coordinated international action. Once that lesson was learned, the psychological foundation of American hegemony was destroyed permanently. Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman had signed more than the end of a commercial agreement. He had signed the death certificate for the American economic empire, triggering a cascade of changes that would establish new centers of global power and influence for the next century. The petrodollar system was dead. The multipolar world had been born, and the country that had benefited most from monetary hegemony would now learn to compete on equal terms with rivals who were no longer willing to subsidize American consumption through forced currency demand. The 50-year American monetary empire had ended not with military conquest or political revolution, but with the stroke of a pen in a Riyadh conference room at 2:34 a.m. on a date that would be remembered as the moment when global power began its historic shift from west to east.